The following is a GoPowerCat.com production.
It is 34 degrees in Ames, 44 in Lubbock, 35 degrees in Manhattan, and here in Studio 73 here in Frisco, it is 48 degrees. This is the Big Insiders.
Welcome to the Big Insiders, your Big 12 sports show, presented by Synergy Financial Partners. Now let's go to booming North Texas, home of Studio 73. Here's your host, Brien Hanley.
All right, welcome to the Big Insiders, here brought to you by Synergy Financial Partners. Hey, thank you guys for joining in. We got my man Alec Busey here from Cyclone Alert, Jared Johnson here from Inside Red Raiders. What is going on, fellas?
What's up, guys? How we doing? Happy to be on. Always good to get a little midweek conversation about college sports.
Yeah, fellas, thanks for having me on. Like I said before we jumped on here live, this is a great idea. And, man, any more conversation we could help drum up about the Big 12, I think is a great thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's start here. Last night, in basketball, we had 4 games. The one that kind of intrigued me the most, I'm just looking at the list here, was the Texas OU game. Look, we thought at the beginning of the year that, you know, the exact opposite of what it's actually played out this year. I was looking at Texas. We thought Texas was going to be really, really good, and not sure that OU was going to be great. All of a sudden, things kind of flip on a switch here. Texas not so good. Their coach saying some crazy things after a loss at home. It was just wild. But then last night, Texas put the screws to them. I mean, they smacked them around a little bit and kind of played things to how we thought the season was going to be. But I think that kind of speaks more to how tough this conference is, Jared.
Yeah, I agree. I was just talking about it on the board right before we got on the show here. And Tech plays Oklahoma in Norman on Saturday. They don't have a midweek game this week. They're coming off a big win, 16-point or 17-point comeback win over BYU. So it's a big game for Oklahoma coming off that loss, and it's a big game for Texas Tech to try and keep ahead of the standings. Their match with Kansas State at 4-1. And there's so many things to come off just what you said in the opening, like that I want to talk about. Rodney Terry's comments after losing to UCF, what y'all think, because my first reaction was like, come on, you know, like,
yes,
you know, obnoxious UT being obnoxious UT,
yes,
you know, being all sensitive again. But then we had on our local radio show, Norris Odiasi, who was the center for Texas Tech when they went to the national championship game back in 2019. And he said he actually liked what Rodney Terry did, that as a player, from his perspective, you know, having another team come in and disrespect you on your own court in the, you know, the line at the end. And so that was a different perspective. And it made me take a step back and think, like, well, maybe he's right. You know, maybe his players will rally for him taking up for his team like that. And UT has so far. I mean, it's kind of worked. So while it came off as obnoxious UT, I mean, maybe there's a method to all that from Terry. So I'm interested to see what y'all think about that.
Yeah, I feel like after Texas entering Saturday's game against Baylor, it was like, are they dead? Like, is this team, do they have any hopes of making an NCAA tournament? And entering the year, I don't know about you, Jared, but I felt like they were a top 3 or 4 team, at least on paper, entering the league. And they just looked horrible. And like, their metrics are bad. They're not very well liked by Ken Pom or the net. I think they're one of the 2 to 3 lowest ranked teams in both metrics. But now they've got 2 really big wins. And I think it's interesting to see where Oklahoma ends up finishing. I think a lot of people are skeptical about them through the non-conference. They only really had one really good opponent in the non-conference in North Carolina, who's turning out to be one of the 4 or 5 best teams in the country, it looks like. And they lost that game, but now they're kind of starting to struggle in Big 12 play. They lost to Iowa State on their home floor. They lost to TCU, I believe. They lost to and then they lost to Texas. So, and it looks like Texas is coming around. And I think the talent on the Texas roster should lend them to being a top 5 team in the league if it all kind of comes together. But also, I feel like it doesn't really fit. They don't really have a true 5. I feel like they have multiple 4s that none of them are elite shooters. Like Mitchell can't really shoot it. Disu's not really a guy who's going to step out on the perimeter and shoot it. And even like Caden Shedrick, who comes off the bench, isn't like a lethal shooter from the perimeter, but all of them can kind of score it on the inside, and they're all good defenders. I just feel like there's so much pressure on their backcourt of Asmus and Hunter to score a ton for them. And that's what happened last night, because Asmus went for 22. And I know Hunter didn't have a good night. He only went for 5, but did have the buzzer beater against Baylor.
Yeah, the one thing about OU, and you kind of hit on it, Alec, is I feel like there's usually a team every year in every conference that starts off like a house of fire. They win all these non-conference games. Maybe they're not really challenged that much in the non-conference, but then everybody thinks they're really, really good. And that team ends up missing the tournament altogether because they get into conference play. Teams know them, and they beat them up. I kind of feel like that's what OU is doing. I'm not saying OU's not good, but I just kind of feel like they might be that team, that teams that, like you said, they weren't challenged very much in the non-con season. And it just feels like they may be able to right the ship here, but it feels like the tide might be turning with some of these good conference teams. Because as we know, the conference is loaded. I mean, the conference, it is a bear every single night. I mean, Kansas can't go to UCF and win. They can't go to West Virginia and win. Right. And those are at the bottom of the league. I mean, West Virginia is not a very good basketball team, but they're good enough to beat Kansas at home. That's how good the league is, man. It's just absolutely nuts.
Brian, that's a key that you said. And I think this is where Oklahoma and Texas, to a lesser degree, they're at a disadvantage, is they don't have a big home advantage. I mean, you look at the Big 12, what do you think about? You don't want to go to Ames. I don't care how good you are. You don't want to go to Lubbock. You don't want to go to Manhattan. You don't want to go to Morgantown. It's going to be a dogfight. No matter the talent on the roster. And if you go to Norman, I mean, they got to beg the fans to go out there. To be honest, I don't know if it's because of the Thunder or what, because obviously they don't have that problem with football. And UT, I mean, that's a football and baseball school. So even if they pack 11,000 fans in there, either one of those schools, it's just not the same feel. You could tell that these Big 12 players, they don't feel that kind of that panic, they don't feel the crowd right on top of them that you feel in an Ames or a Manhattan or a Lubbock or whatever, basically everywhere else in the conference. And I mean, that matters. I mean, I know that's a big key for me with Texas Tech going to Norman. It's like, well, look, Oklahoma's a good team. It's going to be tough, but at least you don't have that hurdle to get over with the atmosphere. So that's a big disadvantage for them. And then also I have questions about Rodney Terry as a coach. I think that's another thing. When I look at the Big 12, you look at coaching. That's why it's good year in and year out. And the adjustments these coaches make before you even get to like a second round or second half of the conference play, it's amazing. It reminds me of the NCAA tournament when you start getting deep, like Sweet 16, Elite 8, and these coaches start making these adjustments and absolutely take away your top 2 or 3 options. Now, what are you going to do? You see that in the Big 12 on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I fully agree with the Rodney Terry point at Texas. You almost kind of feel like their hand was forced last year with having to hire him. I mean, think about Chris Beard was dismissed mid-January. Yeah, like mid-January. I know the kind of unfortunate circumstances with his fiance happened early January, I think. So I think it was mid-January, maybe February, he was dismissed, and they didn't decide to hire Rodney Terry until they won the Sweet 16 game. I think it was where they removed the interim tag, or shortly after they lost in the Elite 8. Like, I felt like their hand was kind of forced, and then you see the contract that he gets, and it's not like it's super lucrative or long term. It almost feels like Texas is kind of trying to protect themselves because they knew what could potentially be there long term with him, and if it works, then you can just extend him and give him a more lucrative contract that's better for the coach. But right now, it doesn't look like that's kind of going to be what it is. But I kind of want to go back to what you said earlier about there being teams in every conference who maybe don't schedule the best out of conference and they get into league play and they feel like they're kind of fraudy, maybe you could say. I feel like the Big 12 maybe had a good amount of those teams entering non-conference play or entering conference play, but so many of them have kind of started to actually prove that they're not fraudy. Like Jarrett, Texas Tech, I think is a good example. They didn't play a ton of people on the non-conference and they're 4-1 in league play. Iowa State is the same way. Like they finished, I think, in the 300s, 340s, something like that in non-conference strength of schedule. Right now they're 3-2 and they have a win over Houston, a road win over Oklahoma, who was ranked in the top 10 at the time. And they went on the road and beat TCU without their best player on Saturday. So I think that they're another example. I think BYU is a great example. I know they're 2-4 in league play, but think about some of the places they've had to go. They had to go to Texas Tech. That's a hard place to play. Houston on Tuesday night, which I'm sure we'll talk about, like they're really hard to beat because of the way they play. They're so good defensively and they're so physical and they're so good on the glass. I think those are a couple teams that have kind of proven that we didn't schedule a ton out of conference, but we're clearly not very fraudy because we're competing with other really good Big 12 teams on a night-to-night basis.
Yeah. So we kind of touched a little bit on this yesterday as far as the number of teams that are going to get into the tournament. I'm under the impression that I think the Big 12 can get 11. I think they can legitimately get 11 teams in. Now, there's going to be some cannibalism that goes on within the league. I mean, we're already starting to see it. But, Jerome Tang put out there that their goal is to get to 9 wins. If you can get to 9 wins in the Big 12, I think you're a lock to get into the tournament. So it just depends on how many teams, number one, can get there. But also, I think there has to be a little bit of separation at the top for that to happen, to get 11 teams in. You got to have somebody take the forefront and say, okay, these 2 teams separated from the rest. And then, the rest are still really good teams that can make the tournament. I don't know that you can have, teams lose 5-6 league games and get 11 teams in the tournament. I don't think that that's possible.
I feel like 8 is probably a good projection, at least in my eyes, because you feel like some people are going to cannibalize themselves and some people are going to have to work their way up. Like BYU, just to keep using them as an example, they're kind of a metrics darling, but again, they're 2-4 in league play. So they're eventually going to have to start winning Big 12 games to, I think, feel really secure about their chances of getting into the Big 12. Like if they finish Big 12 play, you play 18 games. So if they finish Big 12 play 6-12, like they're probably not going to get in.
Yeah, no.
But if you can get to, 8-10, like maybe you've got a chance if you're BYU because of how good your metrics are. I feel like 8 is a more likely number, but then again, like you just look around the country and I don't feel like there's that many teams in the ACC, for example, that deserve to get in. There's 3 or 4 in the Pac-12 that you feel like are deserving of getting in. Maybe. Obviously Arizona, maybe Utah, maybe Oregon, Washington's kind of frisky, Colorado's kind of frisky, but like none of those teams feel like absolute locks other than Arizona. And the Big Ten is just a hot garbage conference of basketball after the top 3. Like no one in that conference is good outside of Purdue, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So I think maybe you could see the Big Ten getting 9-10 teams in if those other leagues don't start to raise their own floor. I don't know what you think though, Jarrett.
Yeah, my first thought was I was thinking 8 or 9. I do think 8-10, that record, as long as there's, like you said, there's metrics involved. How do some of the non-Power 5 schools, how do their tournaments shake out? All those things that we can't possibly know right now. But I do think a good team with a solid resume at 8-10, like I think Texas Tech gets in if they finish 8-10. I mean, in the Big 12, I feel like that's the same for a BYU or several schools in the conference, just because. I'm not smart enough. I'm not a math guy. I was told there'd be no math, but with some of the way the net ratings are and all that stuff, like you could lose to like say a Houston and your ratings go up, which doesn't, or beat like Oklahoma State and your ratings go down. And I'm like, I don't understand how that works. I still don't get how all that works, but it's complicated. But I do think 8 or 9, I feel really good about that. 11 seems high to me. But then again, y'all just made a really good case about the rest of the country. And I do, but I feel very good about 8-10 being a good enough record for a lot of the teams in conference to get into the tournament.
Right. And that's where I stand on with 11 making the tournament or can get into the tournament. I shouldn't say that's going to be that. That's where I stand on it, is because you look around the rest of the country, where are the good teams? I mean, and it seems like the NCAA tournament has gone away from the last few years of putting a lot of mid-majors into the tournament. Like before, like 4 or 5 years ago, they were the darlings. You wanted as many mid-majors as possible. Well, it seems that the NCAA committee has decided, no, we want to get these mid-major teams from these big conferences. We want to get more of those schools into this tournament. So if that's the road that they're going to continue to go down, it's like, okay, well, where do you get these teams from? I mean, we know we're not going to grab, 7, 8 teams, or maybe we will out of the SEC. I don't see 7 or 8 teams out of the SEC that are that good that can make it. A lot of basketball left. But I just don't see that. The ACC, like you mentioned, Alec, there's just not that many good teams. The Big Ten, I mean, let's just be honest. It's just not a very good basketball conference this year. And so the Big 12 is. So I think you have to reward that. And I think if you get to 8-10, you guys are right. 8-10 in this conference, as long as you played somebody in the non-conference, anybody, I think you got to get in. That's just my personal feelings.
Yeah, I think
if you hold serve at home and then win one or two big time road Big 12 conference games with that record, you're in. I mean,
yeah,
I feel strongly about that.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And I think you look at like the SEC, like I think you can make a case it's the second best league in the country this year, along with the Big East. The Big 12 is obviously like far and away number one. If you look at Ken Tom's, conference rankings, it's not even close how much further the Big 12 is in analytics. But like, the SEC, Auburn's really good. Tennessee's really good. I think Bama will probably get in, even though they're kind of a metrics darling right now. Kentucky is like everyone's bandwagon team right now, even though they lost to South Carolina last night. South Carolina got that win. That could get them into the tournament. So I think you're looking at like 5 or 6 teams in the SEC that are a lock, but there's not very many locks in the other leagues. Like in the ACC, is there 3 locks in the ACC with Duke, Carolina, and Clemson? Maybe. I haven't paid a ton of attention. Clemson, maybe. Like in the Pac-12, there's 1 lock in that league. Like it'll get more. It won't be a 1-bid league, but like there's no one else you feel like is
they're not getting 5.
Probably not. And like there's 3 locks in the Big Ten with
that's right.
The 3 teams at the top. And I think the Big East is really close to the SEC. I mean, you got UConn, St. John's will probably get in. There's so many teams in the Big East that are Marquette will get in. Just kind of trying to think of some other teams in the Big East.
Seton Hall's playing well. They keep upsetting teams.
Yeah, Seton Hall, Creighton, Villanova might get in. Those are all teams that have a chance, I think, in the Big East to kind of get in as well. So I think they're kind of close to the SEC in terms of total bids. But, everyone keeps talking about the Mountain West. I don't watch the Mountain West, but, they're like a 5-6 bid league. So
yeah, no. Yeah, and I've heard the same thing. People keep talking about the Mountain West, and I'm like, okay, that's fine. I get it. But like I said, what the NCAA has done the last few years, they've kind of decided we want marquee teams in the tournament. I think a lot of that has to do with who's showing up to these games in the NCAA tournament. It's like you put all these mid-major teams in and they're traveling across the country. You put them in a gym and 4,000 people show up to the game. I mean, you got to get bigger schools with bigger fan bases to travel more to, it just makes more sense. Moving on here. Yeah, we're not ready for a break just yet. Last night, the Houston BYU game, I watched that from start to finish. Houston is good. Houston is a really good basketball team. They don't shoot it great, but kind of what you mentioned, Alec, they just throw it up there and they go after the rebound. I mean, it's a Kelvin Sampson staple that you throw the ball up, they go get the offensive rebound, and then they try to get fouled. And then they just lock you up defensively. They ran BYU off the 3-point line and caused, they had an open look to tie the game at one point, one of the best shooters in the country. He had just been run off the line so much. He wasn't ready to shoot the ball. And it just, I think Houston is the best team in the Big 12. I know a lot of people would say Kansas, but for me and my money, I think Houston is the best team.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those 2 teams. I think Houston is hard to watch at times. Like they're not fun to watch very often offensively because of the way they play. They're not getting a ton of open shots. They're super physical. A lot of their buckets seem to come on second chance opportunities. They had 15 offensive rebounds last night looking at the box score.
Yeah.
Their front court of Francis and Roberts are not super skilled around the rim. Like they came up to Hilton, what would have been the second week of conference play or the first week of conference play, I think, and they lost. And I just vividly remember watching their front court just smoke a couple layups that would have been big baskets. And Iowa State might not have won if they had converted on a few of those. But defensively, they are insane. And they're so tough and they're so physical. Oh, yeah. And like you said, they run you off of the line. But even when you get in on the interior, they're kind of body checking you. Not like in a way that it's a hockey check into the boards, but we might have 2 hands on you, and we're not going to let you just get an easy look at the rim. Like, if that's your brand of basketball, you probably love watching Houston. I think that they can compete with Kansas to win the Big 12. I just don't know if they're going to. Because it feels like Kansas is inevitable. Like, I feel like they win it every year. It's 17 out of the last 20.
Year.
Like, there's some things that you just kind of write in a Sharpie at the beginning of the year, and I think Kansas winning the Big 12 is one of them. But I don't love this Kansas team, Jarrett. Johnny Furphy's kind of emerged, and that's kind of given me some hope that they are as good as some people think they could be. But they're not very deep. They don't shoot it very, very well in terms of volume numbers. And some guys haven't taken the steps that I feel like they need to. I mean, DeJuan Harris still isn't someone who you're super scared of offensively as a shot maker. He certainly creates shots for his teammates, though.
Yeah, I just don't think
there's a lot to unpack there. I think Houston's the best team. No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. There was a lot from what Alex said that was interesting stuff. I do think Houston's the best team in the Big 12 in terms of just neutral court. Kansas is like an institution in the Big 12, right? They're like Dracula. You have to cut their head off, to win the regular season conference crown. And not many teams have been good enough to do that. Let's be honest. I think Houston might be. They have the coaching staff. They have the experience. They remind me of a lot of the Chris Beard physical defensive teams at Texas Tech in terms of like they may go 3 minutes without scoring, but you might go 6. You might, and they especially at home, they where the refs are feeling Sampson's screaming at them, the crowd's right on their back, the refs are swallowing their whistle, and Houston's roughing teams up, and it just compounds on itself, and all of a sudden Houston's up by 12, and you're really feeling it, and the game gets away from you. That's what happened to Texas Tech. And they have good guard play. They have some shot makers in terms of not 3-point shooters, but in terms of when they need a bucket, they got a couple guys who can create off the dribble and score. And then they don't have a lot of length. They have, they have size. Their bigs are like 240, 235. Right. They're not lanky guys, but they're not really like, you're not talking about 7-footers or 6'11" dudes. They're athletic, they're physical, they're big, and they really know how to help each other in terms of defensively. And Kelvin Sampson and his staff do a great job of taking, like I said before, like a lot of the Big 12 coaches, the top tier Big 12 coaches, they're going to take away the first two things you want to do on offense. And then you got to play off that. You got to counter it, or, you have no shot, especially there. I do think, I don't know the schedule. I don't know if Houston plays Kansas. I haven't looked at it, so I haven't broken it down that far. I don't know if they play them in Lawrence or in Houston or how that breaks out, but that might be.
They get them twice.
They do play twice? Okay.
Yeah, I just pulled it up. They play them twice. They play in Lawrence on February 3rd, so a week from this Saturday. And then the last regular season Saturday of the season, Kansas goes to the Repeat Center. So
that could be for
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's some really good teams around that. Like Kansas State, I can't believe Kansas State didn't ranked. Their one Big 12 loss is in Lubbock, and it's a game that Kansas State dominated for most of that game. I mean, I still look back at that like I don't know how Tech came back and won that. I think Kansas State had 11-point lead at the half. They were up by as many as 8 in the final 3 or 4 minutes, and then Tech made a run. And there was all kinds of clock issues, and of course, just like every game, questionable calls and stuff like that. But that's Kansas State's one loss, I believe, in conference play, and they're not in the top 25. That makes zero sense to me.
Yeah, I think a lot of it may have to do with Kansas State really hasn't blown that many teams out this year. Some of the teams that they look at the bottom of the metrics across the country, they haven't blown out. They've won close games. A couple of those, they went to overtime to win. So I think just from the outside looking in, if you're a voter, you see them playing a Chicago State and winning by 5 points or going to overtime against somebody. I think they just look at that and think, oh, well, they must not be very good, versus actually watching the game.
Watch the game,
saying, hey, you know what? These guys are actually pretty good. Maybe they just had an off shooting night, which happens to everybody, So we're going to take a quick break here, and we'll be right back. Come back on the other side here. Just a quick word from our sponsors, Synergy Financial.
At Synergy Financial Partners, the mission is to change the way Americans plan for their financial future. Synergy doesn't just offer you a financial plan. At Synergy, the goal is to help you find your best financial future. Learn more at synergyfinancial.com.
Welcome back to the show. Let's head back to the studio.
All right. Again, thank everybody for joining the Big Insiders here. Please remember to subscribe. Go PowerCat. We are just getting started with the show here. We started last week. It's just going to be an informative, just kind of talking Big 12 stuff, basketball, football, obviously mainly. We'll get into everything here. Jared, I kind of wanted to get into this. the new teams are coming in. They're bringing in the Pac-12 teams that are coming into the conference here. And I know for a long time, Texas Tech kind of sat there a little bit out by itself. Are Texas Tech fans in general, are they happy to see people west of them joining this conference so they're not kind of out there alone?
It's split. If you ask me, I'm excited about I don't know about the geography of it, but just the new blood. I'm excited about that. And some of I've been covering Tech exclusively in this capacity for a decade. And some of the nonsense that goes with playing Texas and Oklahoma, with just them being helmet schools and all that, like, I'm not going to miss that. But then there's the financial aspect of Texas Tech. When UT or OU comes to town, it means a lot financially for the town, the hotels, the restaurants, all that stuff. And, I think this gets into the overall philosophy of college sports, which, we could talk about that for hours, but losing the rivalries, losing the some of the games against teams you played for so long. I think some fans are sad about that. And I get it. It felt like college football and college sports were like the last old school kind of sanctity, whether it was real or imagined. That was the feeling. And now it seems crazier with everything opening up Pandora's box, whether it's right or wrong. Here we are. And the transfer portal and NIL and all this, it feels crazier than pro sports all of a sudden in terms of it being just wide open, Wild West and all that. And the conference realignment and the uncertainty of where everything is headed. I think while it's cool, I think most fans feel like, they're excited about these new teams. And the geography has changed. It's also kind of people are nervous about where is this all headed. I think it is the overall feel.
Gotcha.
One of the things that you really talked about there, Jared, that kind of stuck with me was you feel like college sports is becoming so much more hectic than professional sports. I'm younger than the both of you guys. I'm only 24. But when I was growing up, I feel like there was an off season in college football. Like the BCS National Championship would end and everyone's attention in college sports would shift over to basketball until the end of the NCAA tournament. And then college sports kind of just like went away over the summer until training camp came back. I feel like college football has now become a year-round sport where, starting next year, like the national championship is going to be on January 20th. Guys, that was like 3 days ago. That's nuts.
Wow.
And then you're going to have, transfer portal stuff that's going to be happening throughout the month of December. Coaching carousel stuff is going to be happening at the same time. And coaching assistant moves are happening right now. Like Iowa State lost their linebackers coach to Cincinnati yesterday. So, it feels like it's becoming a year-round thing in college sports and specifically college football where, the transfer portal is going to open again for every student athlete in the spring after spring practices. And that's going to go on for at least a couple of weeks, maybe a couple months. And then at that point, you're approaching June, and June is now the busiest recruiting month of the year for colleges. And then July is like the one time of the year of the 12 months where college football isn't necessarily at like the forefront. But then by the end of July, you're going to media days across the country where the Big 12 is going to be potentially going to Vegas if reports are true. And, the Big 10 will be in Indianapolis and the SEC is going to be in Dallas. And it's like, it just feels like it's always going. And I think for people who love college sports, it's got to be a lot of fun, but you hope there's no exhaustion that comes out of it because it's a lot of fun for me to follow and track. But, and I'm sure you see the click numbers on your transfer portal stuff too. Like people love it. People say they hate it, but like people read it and people consume it. So you hope that there's no exhaustion, but it's just turned into such a year-round thing. And I think, realignment in the last couple of summers and constant realignment discussion in the Big 12 over the last couple of years because of what's happened with Texas and Oklahoma and targeting the schools in the Pac-12 has just made it a year-round thing where it never goes away, I think.
For me, I like
great for business.
It is.
Yeah.
It's fun. I love it. I think it's
great.
Ahead,
Brian.
Brian, I'm sure you feel the same way.
Yeah, no, I like it. Being a former player, I wish the transfer portal was around when I was around. Now, not that I was going to transfer, but I just think
where
it
would
gives
you have
guys. I mean, there's no way I wouldn't. I went to K-State, so there's no chance that I was transferring anywhere. But if I was, it would have been home to Louisville. But that's the whole reason I didn't go to Louisville, because Louisville sucked, and I didn't want to go and get my head beaten in. So I went to Kansas State coming out of junior college. That was literally the whole reason. I was like, I've been a diehard Louisville fan my whole life, and I'm like, I'm not going to go get whipped. I can't deal with losing. And I like it out here in Kansas. I went to Coffeyville. I'm staying out here, and it was the best decision of my life. And I'm not just saying that. I mean, it really was. I met my wife, everything. So, but yeah, if the transfer portal was around, I mean, it just gives kids options. Now, do they need to tweak it? 1,000%. It has to be tweaked. How they're going to do that, I don't know. But there's easy things that you can do. But yeah, it has to be tweaked. And people get mad about that. And I'm like, it's just like a car. You don't buy a car and just say, yep, 100,000 miles with no maintenance whatsoever, and that's it. I'm like, no, you have to tweak this thing and make it better. Constantly try to make it better. And it can get better. It's not ruining college football. I know a lot of people like to say that, but it's just not ruining college football. It isn't. It's giving people options. Is there bad parts of it? Yeah, there are some bad parts to the transfer portal, but that comes back to the tweaking aspect of it. But you are right, Alec. Year-round college football. First of all, I'm in for it. I mean, for it being year-round, I absolutely love it. And not just because we get to sit here and talk about it all the time. I love college football, and I think the more that we can get, the more that we can talk about it, and it can be around on an everyday, just like the NFL. NFL is 12 months out of the year. It just is. And you're right. College football used to go away. It's not doing that anymore. I think it's important. I like the fact that we can talk about it, talk about things that need to be changed, talks about good, talk about bad, controversy, talk about all these things. I just think it's good for the sport and it's good for college athletics.
Yeah, I think the idea of fixing the transfer portal is so difficult because I feel like every time that a rule is kind of put into place or something changes with it that maybe doesn't favor the players, they just get sued. Whether it's
Correct.
What happened with, the situation up in Ohio and West Virginia, I think it was, where now kids are essentially able to transfer as much as they want, or even something like more local, to like a specific fan base. Like it feels like kids are able to kind of try and finagle their way into getting onto a court, or it feels a little bit easier than they maybe were in the past when they had to sit out a year. I think the solution that everyone knows is just making the athletes employees at some point, and there being some sort of agreement to, you got to be here for a certain amount of time before we allow you to transfer, whether that's
absolutely
a full year or 2 years or whatever it is. I don't know. But I think that whole thing becomes really complicated because if you're an employee, you can then technically be fired. So like, how does that work? I don't really know.
Will it be,
I don't know.
Will it be like contracts and all that?
Exactly.
What are the tax ramifications and all, you know, all this stuff? Somebody smarter than me for sure.
Yeah, this is also, I don't know how it works. I just know the employment thing is like, feels inevitable at this point.
I agree. And I think that's kind of the point. Not for me, just speaking from the fan base, from fans that I hear from, is like, this is all like changing constantly. Like for someone like us, when we're talking about, we're trying to explain to, a fan base, a large group of people, what's going on. It's like, hey man, I need to hire somebody full-time just to know what's going on with the rule changes constantly. Because what I said 6 months ago isn't the same anymore. It's changed. Like, and it's, so that's crazy. And I'm not saying that's bad, but some people, and I understand that a lot of people don't like change, especially if it's something they love so much, like college football. It's such a great product. But I don't think, I'm with you, Brian. I don't think these are necessarily bad changes. I think we need to see how things play out. And I also agree that I think it's going to be like where we're contracts and employees and all that. And there'll be some mess to that, but that'll clean some things up as well. I have one question for you, Brian. I like to ask former players a lot. If you could hypothetically, if NIL was around when you played and you could have one deal, what would you get? What would you take?
Mine would have 1,000% would have been some sort of wing eating, something of that nature. Being a former offensive lineman, I would have dived into there's a place here called Rusty's. They used to have 10-cent wings. And I would have just dove into that head first, hit just anything that had to do with eating wings. I would have signed me up. Sign me up.
That's
I would have
awesome.
been all over that, all over something like that. To me, I love those kind of aspects, the NIL stuff. And I know a lot of it is crazy. And I know some of it is out of control. And I understand that part of it. But for the most part, for the people that are doing it right, it helps. And that's the whole thing that I think it's helping kids, be able to market themselves and that kind of stuff. When you don't allow them to have jobs and you don't allow them to do these certain things. Look, I was in a situation, and I tell everybody this, like, I didn't grow up poor, but my parents were teachers. So you tell me, you go ask a teacher about their salaries, how much money can they afford to go give their kid that's in college? I was lucky to get a scholarship. Otherwise, I was going to have to get student loans because my parents just couldn't afford it. And it's not that we were broke or anything like that. It's just there wasn't enough money. They were teachers. And there's nothing wrong with getting student loans. But even as a college athlete, if you got to do what you got to do. But what I'm saying is when you have an opportunity, when they don't allow you to work and they allow you to do some other things to market yourself, to make some money on yourself, I don't think that's a bad thing. The problem is people are going to cheat. They're going to take it, but I look at it this way. People have been cheating forever. The cheating is not new in college athletics.
Yeah,
so if you look at it from that aspect, hey man, they've been cheating forever. So if you're saying that they just started cheating now with NIL, you haven't been paying attention.
That's my favorite thing about NIL discussion, whether you have it with family members who want to know, like, I'm sure you're the same guy at your family gathering, Jared, as I am. And Brian, I'm sure you're the same way. It's like everyone wants to hear what you have to think about what's going on because people like sports. And what are our lives? Yep. Our lives are sports. Most people don't get to hop online and talk about sports at 1:00 in the afternoon like we do. They're, calculating numbers at the office. If you're listening to us while you're doing that, thank you. You have an important job.
Absolutely.
But like, I think about people are always talking about like, well, isn't NIL just going to lead to more cheating? I'm like, who cares? Like, people are like, well, we need a salary cap. There was a salary cap for 100 years in college sports and it was zero. How did that work for everyone for 100 years? It didn't work. Like it wasn't a thing. And I think if anything, what NIL has shown is that there was a belief that like the rich teams were only going to get richer when you were thinking about it from a college football perspective. Alabama and Clemson and whoever, from a recruiting perspective, that really hasn't proven to be true. You've seen schools like Miami kind of rise up in the rankings, where I think they finished top 5 this year. I mean, Texas has always recruited really well. But they've kind of risen up. And, there's been other schools. Mizzou, I think, is a great example of they've started to get kids. And then the transfer portal, I think, is another example where it's like schools are able to get talent that they maybe weren't able to get before. And think about it from like 2014, 2015, that first year of the CFP to like 2018, all everyone heard about and complained about was it's always Alabama and Clemson playing. Yeah. Well, we haven't had that for a while. And I think that that's kind of a side effect of NIL and where things have kind of gone with it, where talent has diversified itself out and they're no longer going to maybe 8 to 10 schools in the country. They're going to 12 to 15 schools, which doesn't seem like a huge difference, but that's a massive difference when you're talking about the top 100 recruits.
That's right. It's massive.
It's interesting too, when you're covering recruiting an adult as opposed to a teenager, let's be honest, the things that are important to them. Let's say a Texas Tech or Iowa State or a Kansas State, in that kind of tier, can get a guy who is more talented than perhaps they would have coming out of the high school ranks because they care about what their friends say or where they're going. They care about the uniforms, all that kind of stuff that when you get older and you start having to make some real business decisions about playing time, want to go to the league, all that other stuff, things change. Your perspective changes as it should, right? I mean, absolutely. No matter what you do, your perspective should change in that time. So that's interesting. I think I could not agree with you more that the transfer portal has evened the field. It has not widened the gap at all. I mean, and the evidence is all over the country. And in terms of like the family gatherings and what my family says, well, my dad echoes what Brien said. He played ball at TCU, and he always talks about that nonsense of laundry money. He said, give me a break. They won't let you work. They're making all this money off of you playing, and, you're broke. and no matter, unless you are rich, your family come from like a well-off family, they're not going to be able to just float you, and
Correct.
it's not, and like the casual fan will say, well, they get a full ride. I wish I had that. Yeah, but you worked. You had the option to go work, and
Correct.
these athletes can't. And I think some of the things like, oh, I'm starving. There's a training table. Come on, everybody's got. I think that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but yeah, it was un-American what was happening with the college athletes. So it makes sense to me that the courts ruled the way they did. And
yeah,
I mean, it is what it is now. So I don't think I don't think there should be any kind of moral judgment on it.
No.
Like a lot of people seem to have, like, oh, these kids, they just get everything. No, they're getting like market share. They're getting market value. And the programs that have the nice initiatives, like Texas Tech has a Matador Club. Everybody who's in the game, really in the game, has some kind of, or at least one initiative. And what's been really cool for me is to see a lot of these walk-ons get, like, for example, a base of $25,000 so that they're not inundated with these student loans, because that's a whole nother discussion. Is the tuition cost. I mean, the tuition costs for me to graduate Texas Tech in the 90s doesn't even cover a year nowadays. It blows my mind. So that goes a long way. And in interviewing a lot of the athletes, I mean, they're putting it away for a down payment on their house. They're not having to pay these student loans. It's a big deal. It makes it gives them a good start in their early adulthood after playing.
Yeah, and I just love going back to the changes thing that you were talking about earlier, Jared. I feel like it's almost a good thing that all of these changes are happening like now. When it comes to college sports, I feel like within like the 2020 to 2024 time frame, more changes are happening within this 4-year time frame than any other time in college sports. And I think you can look ahead to 2024 specifically this summer and this coming football season, and there's more changes this year. And I'm happy that those are all happening at the same time with conference realignment. Like, I'm happy that Texas and Oklahoma are going to the SEC, and all the 4 schools are going to the Big Ten at the same time, and the 4 schools are coming to the Big 12 at the same time. If we were going to lose a conference, I'm happy that it all happened at the same time. And, NIL is happening at the same time, and the transfer portal is happening at the same time, instead of, all right, the portal goes into effect in 2021, and then in 2024, we're going to do realignment. And then in 2027, we're going to do NIL. And I know, like, that's not at all how it happened, but I'm happy it didn't go that way. And I'm happy everything is just kind of happening all at one time. And I think it's really hard to not be excited about 2024. Like, I'm someone who really enjoyed watching the Pac-12. As someone who lives on his own and stays up late, like, I really enjoyed staying up until 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning watching Pac-12 football and basketball. But those schools are still going to be playing, whether they're in the Big 10 or they're in the Big 12. They're still going to be playing at the same time. They're going to be playing, still fun and really exciting games. It just sucks that, we lost a whole conference and some of the tradition that goes along with that. But, it takes time, and, those new traditions and those new rivalries will be established. It just takes time, and eventually it'll happen.
Well, that's kind of my thinking.
One thing I want to say real quick, Brian, I'm sorry, I want to jump in. It was a me or you situation with the Pac-12 or Big 12. I felt
it was
like one of those conferences was going to go away. So while like you, I like the Pac-12. I'm not happy that happened, but for what we do, I care a lot more about the Big 12 just because it's the region I grew up in, it's who I cover, all that stuff. So me or you situation, I'm kind of surprised because it looked like the Big 12 was dead in the water, right? I mean, just like a year before all the Pac-12 stuff happened. So I felt like, new leadership in the Big 12, some of the things that happened with the Big 12, enabled at least survival for the coming years. How long? I don't know. It's changed. Like you said, all these things are happening at the same time. We'll have to see, but at least it's viable. The Big 12 is viable as we sit here today.
Right.
When a year and a half ago, I would have been like, I don't know. I think it's going to be done. So.
Well, and Fitz has mentioned this several times, and I think one of the big things is that, first of all, the Pac-12 blinked, and we just went right past them. That's their own fault, And for a school like Kansas State, we could have been Washington State. It was, Kansas. People may have wanted they would have wanted Kansas to do. They want Kansas State along with it. So I'm just glad that we didn't have to make that choice, or we didn't have to have those discussions or conversations. I mean, like you said, Jared, it's us or them, and I'm glad it was us that that we got to stick around. So, but getting back to, just the conference itself, I think with the new leadership, building a basketball brand, and like I mentioned, Fitz has said this several times, building a basketball brand, I think, can be the Big 12 staple. Not that we're not a football conference. I don't want to say that at all. But what I am saying is that we can market ourselves as the best basketball conference in the country year in and year out. And I think it's a mistake if we don't lean into that a little bit more. And I think that Brett Yormark is trying to do that, trying to get an own network deal for just basketball and make it separate. Because I think if you lean into that, look at the Big East. The Big East doesn't even have football, but they have a basketball contract. And yeah, it's East Coast stuff, but we watch it. I watch it all the time, and it's good basketball. And I think we can do the exact same thing if the Big 12 decides that they just want to lean into that. Don't ignore football. Make football still the priority, but also make basketball a priority as well.
Yeah, from everything I've seen, that's the plan,
ahead,
right? I mean, like you said. No, that's
Go
it.
ahead, Jarrett.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like Brett Yormark deserves a lot of credit for that, right? Like, he seems to understand. I feel like he seems to understand that the Big 12 will struggle to compete from a viewership numbers and even on the field perspective with, the resources that exist in the SEC and the Big 10 moving forward, whether it's financially, historically, regionality with where talent comes from. The South has always dominated college football, right? Like, you've got your few schools in the North, Ohio State and Michigan, that have done well, but historically the schools in the South have always done really well in college football. But anyone can win in basketball. Literally anyone can win. No one thought Kansas State was going to be good at basketball last year. They were picked to finish last in the league, and they were, 5 minutes away from going to a Final Four, right? Yep. Like, you get a couple really good players on a team. You have, they got Keontae Johnson out of the portal. And sure, there was some fortune with his situation and that kind of turning into the player he was before his heart injury. And, anyone can be successful in basketball. And I think the Big 12 has shown that. Like, Baylor was a horrible, horrible, horrible program before Scott Drew got there. And they were bad when he first got there. I mean, sure, it took him, 15, 20 years to win a national title at Baylor, but he did it. No one would have said in 2002 or 2000, whenever he was hired, that Scott Drew is going to win a national championship at Baylor, and he did it. And he sustained really high success there for a really long time. And if you can win a national championship at Baylor, you can win a national championship anywhere.
Yeah, you can.
Especially in basketball. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Big 12 has the potential to be successful in basketball for the long time, because you have schools like Baylor who have proven that they can win a national championship, and so many schools are kind of following that same model. I mean, Jerome Tang is from Scott Drew tree. Graham McCasland is from the Scott Drew tree, right? Like, those are schools that are trying to find their version of Scott Drew in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think I just think that they're leaning into it is going to be good for the conference overall. I think leaning into basketball, just making that, again, not more emphasis than football, but making it an emphasis, just as big a priority. I think it's going to be just as good. I think it's going to be great for the conference, guys. So I appreciate you guys joining us today, man. I promise you we are going to bring you guys back as many times as you guys can. We're just getting started with this thing. Like I said, we're talking Big 12. Great conversation today, guys. I appreciate the time today.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. And big game for people in K-State country and Iowa State country tonight at Hilton Coliseum. And hopefully people are able to tune in and watch that one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Jarrett. I appreciate it, my man.
All right. Thanks, Brien. Thanks, Alec. Thank you.
Thanks,
really
guys.
appreciate it. It was fun.
All right.
At Synergy Financial Partners, the vision is to build the world's largest consumer financial education and empowerment company. Synergy doesn't just offer you a financial plan. At Synergy, the goal is to help you find your best financial future. Learn more at synergyfinancial.com.
Welcome back to the show. Let's head back to the studio.
All right. Well, Fitz, good conversation today. Great conversation today, breaking stuff down. Again, I know you've mentioned this several times as far as basketball-wise in the Big 12, just leaning into that contract, getting a separate contract by itself, and just saying we are going to be the premier league within the country. Can't hear you.
if you're a person that is interested in this kind of stuff, I would start paying attention to. I just saw something about the NBA and Amazon. We've got the WWE and Netflix.
Yep.
All of this is interconnected. I mean, all of it can play into the Big 12. What's going to happen, and this is the biggest piece probably, what's going to happen with the NBA and Turner? And the reason I bring that up is because Brett Yormark is really plugged into Turner. Being an NBA guy, I don't know that it was anything of his doing, but I thought it was interesting that K-State opened the season in Las Vegas on Turner, which is not a typical college basketball landing spot.
No.
And so I think as we get closer to this, and if there's another round of realignment, if they bring in a UConn, if they bring in, let's see, one of the Carolina schools or something like that, the value of Big 12 basketball, while not coming anywhere near football or certainly not the NBA, might give Turner something to replace programming with, and give the Big 12 kind of its own platform. I'm just fascinated by it, Brian, and every little move. Like when I saw Netflix and Amazon Prime getting involved in some of this stuff, I'm like, all these parts move around and cause dominoes to fall around them, and it's going to happen. And eventually, I think Brett Yormark's exactly right. He's going to be able to market Big 12 basketball separate from football and get a separate contract that will have an impact, that'll be substantial. He thinks like 15, 20 million a school. And if you subtract that out of what they're already paying, they're only paying like 10% of the contract for basketball. That's what they say. So if they pull that off, they're going to close the gap on the Big Ten and SEC. And again, like you said, Brian, this is not about de-emphasizing football. This is just about finding a way to close the gap between what they're getting for their football and what the Big 12 can get for their football by getting more for basketball than they can get.
Right. Well, the thing that you brought up that is, to me, that's most interesting, and I've been digging in a little bit, the whole Turner thing. It's like, look, the NCAA tournament is on Turner. There's a reason for that. They're not putting the NCAA tournament on Turner because it doesn't get ratings, because people don't want to watch college basketball. Look, I get it. It's March Madness, but what was it, 5-6 years ago and infinitely before that, it was only on CBS. It was the only channel that it was on. And Turner now has dipped their toe into it. And what's it on? Turner, TNT, True TV. I go, if the Big 12 can somehow dip into that and get a Wednesday game and throw on 3 or 4 Saturday games, which doesn't interfere with anything that they do with the NBA, if they can do that, I think they're going to do that. I think they would jump at the chance to be able to do something like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you're right. Turner just kind of shows up at the end of the season to broadcast games, does an incredible job. They use a lot of their NBA talent, but certainly on the desk. But they do things in a way, I'll just say it. I'm not an NBA fan, but I think the way Turner handles NBA basketball is the best in the business of any sport. Now, I don't watch golf or auto racing. Maybe someone does better in those, but I think from the main American sports that are viewer sports, they got a ball in them, and I think they do the best job of anyone, and being associated with them would be first class. And that's what Brett Yormark wants to do.
Yeah, I think it would be great, man. All right, man. Good show today. I appreciate you taking the time again, everybody, to join us. We'll be back again tomorrow. Hopefully we do it better. Thanks, Fitz.
Thank you, brother.
All right.
This has been a GoPowerCat.com and Spirit Street production. Please support this show by subscribing to this YouTube channel or follow us on your favorite podcast platform.